He sold his horse for a gold nugget. Then the stranger who bought it changed his fate. The wind in perdition. Gulch didn't just howl. It scraped a man's soul raw. The hardscrabble town reeked of desperation, regret, and a chilling finality. Silas stood before the quiet stranger, his knuckles bone white on the reins of his last companion. Ghost, his horse, was the final living piece of a life of honor he'd long since lost. His desperate choice was born from an empty belly and a hollowed-out spirit. He made the trade, the warm, familiar leather of the reins for a single, heavy gold nugget. The stranger's eyes, ancient and knowing, held no judgment, only a deep, unsettling pity that felt worse than scorn. Silas turned his back on the only friend he had left. The cold weight of the gold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the life he'd just sold. He believed he was buying a future. He had no idea he was clutching a cursed invitation, a piece of a bloody history that was already hunting him down. The wind in Perdition Gulch didn't just howl. It scraped a man's soul raw. It was a sermon of grit and gravel preaching a gospel of finality. Here at the edge of the world, hope came to die. Silas stood in the teeth of that wind, his knuckles bone white on the reins. They were worn smooth, the leather darkened by years of sweat and trust. His gaze was fixed on the warped planks of the livery, on anything but the warm, knowing eyes of the animal beside him. Ghost. The name was a whisper of what Silas used to be. The horse was the last living piece of a life of honor, a four-legged memory of his father's ranch of green pastures of a time when the horizon was a promise, not a threat. Now the horizon was just a longer road to nowhere. Across from him the stranger waited. He was a man carved from old hickory, and silence his face a roadmap of canyons and long-forgotten sorrows. He didn't look at Silas. His eyes, ancient and unsettlingly calm, were on the horse. He saw the proud arch of Ghost's neck, the intelligence in the flick of his ears. He saw the bond. And that made this so much worse. He's a fine animal. The stranger set his voice a low rumble like stones shifting deep underground. Silas grunted, his throat tight. He is. The words tasted like betrayal. And you'll trade him for this. The stranger opened his palm. Resting in it was a single heavy gold nugget. It was ugly, misshapen, but it shone with the dull, brutal light, a fistful of condensed sunshine. It was a prayer for a man who had forgotten how to pray. Silas's stomach twisted. For weeks it had been a clawing, empty beast. This nugget could silence it. It could buy a steak, a bottle of real whiskey, a clean bed. It could buy him a tomorrow. He had to do it. He was down to the nub. The horse for the nugget. Silas set his voice hard as iron, a desperate attempt to armor his breaking heart. That's the deal. The stranger's gaze finally shifted from the horse to him. It was not a look of scorn or even of business. It was pity, a deep, abyssal pity that stripped Silas bare. "The price is higher than that sun," the stranger murmured so low the wind almost stole the words. "But I'll pay it." He held out the nugget. Silas forced his hand to move to release the reins he had held for a decade. The leather felt like it was tearing his own skin. He took the gold. It was heavy, shockingly so, and cold. Colder than a tombstone. He didn't watch the stranger lead Ghost away. He couldn't. He just stood there as the sound of familiar hoofbeats faded, replaced by the howling of the wind, which now sounded terribly accusingly like his own name. He had traded a heartbeat for a rock. The saloon was a pit of noise and smoke, but it was better than the silence. Silas slid onto a stool at the bar, the wood sticky beneath his fingers. He slapped the nugget down. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that turned heads. "Whiskey," he rasped to the bartender. "The good stuff. And a steak. Bloody." The bartender's eyes widened at the sight of the gold, his professional cynicism melting into naked greed. "Right away, sir. Anything you want." The word "sir" felt foreign. For the first time in a year, he wasn't a drifter, a beggar, a ghost. He was a man with gold. He wrapped his hand around the cold, smooth weight of it, a talisman against the hollowness spreading through his chest. The whiskey came. He downed it in one go, the burn a welcome punishment. It did nothing to warm the ice in his gut. The steak arrived sizzling on a tin plate, the smell rich and savory. He ate like a wolf, tearing at the meat, but it tasted of nothing. It was just fuel. A shadow fell over him. He looked up. A grizzled miner with a tangled beard and eyes like chips of flint leaned against the bar beside him. "That's a hell of a find, friend," the miner grunted, nodding at the nugget. Silas instinctively covered it with his hand. "Found it fair and square." "Oh, I ain't doubtin' you," the miner said, taking a swig from his mug. "Just sayin', a rock like that tells a story. And some stories attract the wrong kind of listeners. Best keep it close." The man's eyes flickered toward a corner of the saloon where two men sat in shadow. They weren't miners. They were too still, their clothes too dark. They were watching him. One of them had a long, jagged scar that cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of vicious surprise. Silas's blood ran cold. The miner gave him a final knowing look and shuffled away. The joy of his sudden fortune had curdled into a new kind of fear. The nugget wasn't a key. It was a beacon, a target. He finished his meal, the food now a heavy lump in his stomach. He paid the bartender, who chipped a piece from the nugget with a hammer and chisel, the sound like a breaking bone. With the gold dust and the smaller piece in his pouch, Silas stood to leave, acutely aware of the eyes on his back. The warmth of the saloon felt like a lie. The cold of the street was the truth. He found a room in a dilapidated boarding house at the end of the street, the kind of place where men's dreams went to be forgotten. The room was small, smelling of dust and sorrow. He barred the door, the scraping of the wood, a lonely final sound. He sat on the lumpy cot, the floorboards groaning beneath him. He pulled the nugget from his pocket. In the dim moonlight filtering through the grimy window, it didn't look like hope anymore. It looked like a skull. A heavy, golden, grinning skull. He had bought his tomorrow. But as he lay in the dark, clutching the cold metal, a new thought chilled him far more than the wind outside. What if tomorrow came looking for him first? Creak. The floorboard in the hallway outside his door sounded. It wasn't the settling of an old house. It was a footstep, slow, deliberate. Someone was there, waiting. Silas didn't breathe. He didn't move. He became a creature of pure, primal listening, his heart a frantic drum against the cage of his ribs. The floorboard creaked again, closer this time, a slow, patient sound that was infinitely more terrifying than a sudden crash. It was the sound of a predator that knew its prey was trapped. He slid from the cot, his hand reaching for the only weapon. He had a loose, heavy leg from the broken chair in the corner. It was a pathetic defense. A stick against a storm, a soft rap on the door. Not the splintering kick of a bandit, but a polite, measured knock. The civility of it was somehow the most menacing thing of all. Silas. The voice was not the gravelly sneer he expected. It was the low, rumbling tone from the livery. The stranger. The man who had taken Ghost. A new wave of emotion, hot and bitter, washed over Silas's fear. Anger. He stalked to the door club, held ready. "What do you want?" he snarled through the wood. "Come to see how your gold's spending." "I didn't come for the gold, son," the voice replied, calm as a winter morning. "I came because of it." "Open the door. The men you're worried about are still in the saloon. But they won't be for long." How did he know the question hung in the air, a hook that snagged Silas's fury and pulled him against all instinct toward the latch? He slowly, carefully slid the bar free. The old stranger stood there, his frame silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He wasn't armed, not visibly, but he carried an authority that a dozen pistols couldn't grant. He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. His eyes fell on the nugget which Silas had left sitting on the nightstand, a lump of cursed moonlight. "You think that's a ticket to a new life?" the stranger said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. "You're wrong. It's a tombstone." "It's gold," Silas spat, defensive. "That's all." "No." The stranger stepped closer, his shadow swallowing what little light there was in the room. He pointed a long, steady finger at the nugget. "Look closer. Not at the shine. At the flaw." Silas squinted. There, on one side of the ugly rock, was a small, deep impression he hadn't noticed before. It was curved with a faint line down the middle. A horseshoe. A broken one. "Every piece of gold from the Black Creek payroll heist has that mark," the stranger said, his voice dropping into a whisper that felt heavier than a shout. "A little joke from their leader, Jedediah Kane. He branded the gold the same way he brands his horses and his men." The floor seemed to fall away from beneath Silas's feet, leaving him dangling over an abyss of other men's sins. Black Creek. The name was whispered all over the territory. A government payroll wagon hit. Every guard, every driver slaughtered. No witnesses, no trail, just stories of ghosts who struck and vanished. They didn't vanish. The stranger continued, his eyes locked on Silas's, seeing the dawning horror there. "They're very real, and now they think you're one of them, or that you robbed the robber. Kane doesn't tolerate loose ends. He's a man who burns down a whole forest just to kill one snake." Silas stumbled back onto the cot, the strength gone from his legs. He stared at the nugget. It was no longer a promise. It was an accusation, a death sentence. Why Silas whispered the word, a ragged breath. "Why are you telling me this? Who are you?" The stranger pulled a rickety chair from the corner and sat the wood, groaning in protest. He seemed to fill the small room not with his size but with the sheer weight of his past. "The name is Elias Vance. And Jedediah Kane. He took something from me a long time ago. Something more than gold." The words were simple, but they carried the echo of a pain so vast Silas could feel the chill of it. "I've been hunting him ever since." "So what do you want with me?" Silas asked, his mind reeling. "I'm no gunslinger." "I'm nobody. You're the man holding his calling card," Elias said. "He will come for you, and when he does, I will be there." He paused, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "I saw the way you looked at that horse. You sold a part of your own soul today. I know what that feels like. But a man who could love an animal like that, he might still have a spine. I'm betting what's left of my life on it." A fragile, terrifying alliance was forged in that dusty, desperate room. A pact made between a broken man and a ghost. Silas finally understood. The miner's warning. The men in the corner. They weren't just curious. They were scouts. "We have to get out of here," Silas said, a new urgency in his voice. "That was the plan," Elias agreed, rising to his feet. "But we're already out of time." He moved to the grimy window and carefully peeked through a crack in the frame. He was silent for a long moment. When he turned back, his face was grim. "They're out there," he said. "Across the street. The one with the scar. They're watching the building." Silas felt a cold dread clamp down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. It wasn't a vague threat anymore. It wasn't a story about a man named Kane. It was here. Now. The beast was outside his door. They hadn't just been followed, they had been caged. The cage was silent. Outside the town of Perdition, Gulch slept a drunk and fitful sleep. Inside the small room, the air was a taut wire of dread vibrating with every shallow breath Silas took. He felt it then, the crushing, absolute weight of his mistake. The gold nugget on the nightstand seemed to drink the moonlight, leaving nothing but shadow. It was a cold, dead star, and he was trapped in its gravity. "We're finished," Silas whispered the words, surrender. "They'll wait for the sun. There's nowhere to run." Elias Vance stood by the window, a sliver of a man against the grimy pane. He was unnervingly still, not like a cornered animal, but like a mountain waiting for the storm to break against it. "They want us to wait," Elias said, his voice a low counterpoint to the wind. "They want the fear to do their work for them, to make us sloppy. We move now, while the night is still a shroud." He turned from the window, and in the gloom Silas could see the glint of a hunter's calculation in his eyes. "There's a lean-to roof at the back of this building over the alley. It's a 12-foot drop. From there, the rooftops connect to the livery at the far end of the street. But they'll have a man watching the alley. So we're still trapped," Silas said, the hope dying as soon as it was born. "Only if they're looking," Elias corrected. He reached into his coat and produced a small, smooth river stone. "We just have to give them something more interesting to look at." The plan was desperate, a fool's gambit woven from shadow and chance. From their window, they had a clear view of the saloon's front where the horses of Cain's men were tied. Elias slid the window open a crack, the sound a piercing shriek in the quiet. They both froze, listening. Nothing. The guards across the street hadn't moved. Elias held the stone between his thumb and forefinger. He wasn't just a man. He was a study in patience, his entire being focused on the singular coming moment. He waited for a gust of wind, a passing cloud, a drunkard's shout, any small chaos to mask his own. A door slammed down the street. A dog barked. Now. With a flick of his wrist, Elias sent the stone sailing through the night air. It was a perfect silent arc that ended with a sharp metallic clang as it struck the iron horse trough in front of the saloon. The sound shattered the night. The horses, startled, whinnied and pulled at their reins. One reared its eyes wide with panic. The two scouts across the street jerked to attention, their focus snapping from the boarding house to the commotion. They cursed, rising from their hiding spot and moving toward the panicked animals. "Go," Elias commanded. "Don't think. Just move." There was no time for the fear to take hold. Silas was already at the back window, throwing it open. The night air rushed in cold and tasting of dust and freedom. Below them, the alley was a river of blackness. The lean-to roof was a dark, slanted promise. Elias went first. He swung his legs over the sill and dropped, with a lithe, surprising grace, his landing a soft thud that was barely audible. He looked up, his face a pale oval in the dark. It was Silas's turn. He stood on the precipice. It wasn't just a jump to a roof. It was a leap of faith, a choice. He could stay here, clutching his cursed gold, and wait for death, or he could jump into the unknown, trusting the ghost who had bought his soul. He thought of Ghost. He thought of the feel of the reins in his hands. He jumped. The landing jarred his bones, the impact a brutal reminder that he was alive. He scrambled for purchase on the slanted shingles, his breath a ragged sob in his throat. For a dizzying moment he felt a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had acted. He had chosen. For the first time since he'd sold his horse, he wasn't just running from something. He was running toward a chance. They moved like wraiths across the rooftops, a desperate two-man pilgrimage under the cold, indifferent eyes of the stars. The town was a patchwork of shadow and faint light, below them a sleeping beast, unaware of the drama playing out on its spine. The sounds of the diversion, shouts, the calming of horses faded behind them. They were almost there. The livery stable loomed ahead, its familiar shape a beacon of hope. It meant horses. It meant escape. They dropped into the back of the livery landing softly in a pile of hay that smelled of sweet grass and home. The scent was an agonizing reminder of Ghost, but there was no time for grief. The air inside was still and heavy. "We need 2 fast mounts," Elias whispered, moving toward the stalls. "Saddle them quickly. We ride north." Hope, fragile and bright, bloomed in Silas's chest. They had made it. They were free. He followed Elias deeper into the stable, his eyes adjusting to the deep gloom. He reached for a saddle hanging on a post. His fingers brushed against something wet and warm. He pulled his hand back, staring at the dark stain on his fingertips. A low, sick feeling coiled in his gut. Elias had frozen a few feet ahead, his hand hovering over a stall door. He had heard it too. A soft, gurgling sigh. Elias slowly pushed the stall door open. Lying in the straw, his eyes wide with a final terrible surprise, was the stable boy. The cheerful, optimistic boy from that morning. A dark, spreading stain marred his simple shirt. He wasn't dead. Not yet. But he was close, his life draining away into the hay. They weren't just being watched. They were being herded. Cain's men weren't just waiting for them to make a mistake. They were setting the board, and every piece was a sacrifice. A shadow moved at the far end of the stable. A voice slick with cruel amusement slid out of the darkness. "Took you long enough, old man." It was the man with the scar. "The boss is getting impatient." The world narrowed to the space of a dusty stable, thick with the smell of hay and fresh blood. Time itself seemed to curdle. The stable boy's life was leaking away into the dirt floor, a quiet, gurgling sigh that was the most brutal sound Silas had ever heard. This was because of him. The boy was dying because Silas had wanted a steak and a bed. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. The voice from the shadows materialized into a man. The scar over his left eye was a river of puckered flesh, a permanent sneer carved by some long-ago violence. He wasn't alone. Another figure melted out of the darkness behind him, a human-shaped predator with a shotgun held loosely in his hands. "Took you long enough," Old Man Scar said, his voice slick with amusement. He gestured with his chin toward the dying boy. "The boss is getting impatient. We had to leave him a message to hurry you along." A message. The boy was a message. Something broke inside Silas. It was the last brittle remnant of his self-pity. It shattered, and in its place, a cold, clean rage began to burn. Elias stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Silas, a subtle shield. His posture was relaxed, but his stillness was that of a coiled rattlesnake. "The boy is not part of this, friend. There's no need for this to go any further." Scar let out a short, ugly laugh. "He ain't a part of it anymore, that's for damn sure. He served his purpose. Now, the gold? The boss wants it back, and he wants the man who took it. He's not particular about the order." His eyes, cold and dead as a winter sky, were fixed on Silas. This was it. The end of the line. A squalid death in a dusty stable, his only legacy a stolen nugget and a dead child. No. The rage inside Silas was a fire now burning away the fear. He looked at the dying boy, at the small flickering flame of a life about to be extinguished by casual cruelty. He thought of Ghost, sold for a lie. He thought of the man he used to be, a man who would have died before letting this happen. The gold Silas heard himself say, his voice a strange, hoarse whisper. "It's in my room, at the boarding house." Scar grinned, a predator sensing a final surrender. "Well now, see, that wasn't so hard. I'll take you there," Silas said, taking a small, shuffling step forward. It was a lie, a desperate, hopeless, soul-saving lie. His eyes darted to the side, locking on a rusty lantern hanging from a nail on a nearby post. It was lit, its flame casting long, dancing shadows. Elias saw the flicker in his eyes. He saw the shift in his posture, and in a fraction of a second, a silent understanding passed between them. "You ain't going nowhere," Scar sneered, raising his pistol. But Silas was already moving. He didn't lunge for the gun. He lunged for the lantern. He ripped it from its post, and with a desperate roar that was half fury and half prayer, he hurled it into the driest, deepest pile of hay at the far end of the stable. The glass shattered. The oil ignited. The world exploded. Whoosh! A wall of yellow-orange flame roared to life, devouring the dry hay with a terrible hunger. Thick, choking smoke billowed through the stable, instantly turning the tense standoff into a vision of hell. The horses screamed in terror, kicking against their stalls. For a heartbeat, chaos was king. And in that heartbeat, Elias moved. He wasn't an old man anymore. He was a whisper and a thunderclap. From Silas's smoke-stung eyes, it was a blur. Elias launched himself not at Scar, but at the second man, the one with the shotgun. He moved under the man's panicked aim, and there was a sickening wet crack of bone on bone. The man crumpled without a sound, his shotgun clattering on the floor. Scar, blinded for a moment by the fire, and Smoke roared in rage and fired his pistol into the swirling chaos. The bullet went wide, splintering a stall door. Silas didn't wait. He grabbed a heavy pitchfork leaning against the wall. It felt clumsy in his hands, but it was solid. It was real. As Scar turned toward him, his face a demonic mask in the firelight, Silas charged, driving the tines of the pitchfork forward. It wasn't a fencer's thrust, it was the desperate shove of a drowning man. Scar yelled, batting the pitchfork aside with his gun barrel, but the move had bought a precious second. Elias was there. He slammed into Scar from the side, a silent, unstoppable force. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, grappling in the spreading firelight. The horses, now! Elias roared, his voice strained. Silas didn't need to be told twice. He ran to the nearest stalls, his heart hammering, and began unlatching the doors. The terrified animals bolted, adding to the pandemonium. He grabbed the reins of a powerful bay and a sturdy mare, pulling them toward the massive stable doors. He risked a glance back. Elias had Scar's gun arm pinned. He delivered a swift, brutal elbow to the man's throat. Scar choked his grip, loosening. Elias wrenched the pistol free and brought the heavy butt of it down hard on the man's temple. Scar went limp. The fire was roaring now, licking at the rafters. The whole structure was about to go up. Silas pulled the heavy bar from the stable doors and threw them open. He leaped onto the back of the bay as Elias mounted the mare. Together they spurred the horses out into the night, a wild exodus of fire and thunder. They galloped down the main street, two riders born from a burning stable, leaving the screams and the rising flames behind them. They didn't stop until the town was a fading orange glow against the black velvet of the plains. They rode in silence, the only sound the pounding of hooves and their own ragged breathing. When they finally slowed to a walk miles out in the desolate wilderness, Elias rode up beside him. He reached into his coat and pulled out Scar's pistol, a heavy Colt Peacemaker. He held it out to Silas. Silas stared at it. The firelight was gone, replaced by the cold, clean light of the moon. He thought of the boy in the straw. "I'm no gunman, Elias," he said, his voice hollow. "You threw the lantern." Elias replied, his voice flat. "You picked up the pitchfork. You've got the fight in you. You just forgot where it was." He pushed the gun into Silas's hand. "You're done being the bait, son. From now on, you learn to be the hunter." Silas closed his fist around the grip. The checkered wood was rough against his palm. The weapon was heavy, so much heavier than the gold had ever been. The world beyond Perdition Gulch was a harsh and silent classroom. The sun was a hammer, the wind was a file, and the dust was a constant gritty reminder of their own mortality. They rode north into a sea of cracked earth and skeletal mesas, two men bound by a crime they hadn't committed. The land was a godless canvas, and Elias Vance was teaching Silas how to read its terrible scripture. The gun Elias had given him was a leaden weight on his hip, a constant cold pressure against his thigh. It felt less like a tool and more like a tumor, a foreign growth he couldn't get used to. At first he rode with his hand hovering over it, a nervous tick that Elias quickly corrected. "A gun isn't a worry stone, son," the old man said one afternoon, his voice dry as the air. "You only touch it for one reason. Until then, you forget it's there. Let your eyes be your weapon." And so the lessons began. They were not lessons of the gun range, but of the earth. Elias taught him how to see, how to distinguish the track of a shod horse from a wild one, how to tell by the depth of the print, how fast it was moving and how tired it was. He showed him how a bent twig, a disturbed patch of lichen on a rock, a flock of birds taking flight in the distance, how all these things were words in a language of survival. "Cain's men ride hard and careless," Elias explained, kneeling by a set of tracks. "They think the wasteland hides them, but they scar the land. They leave a trail of broken things. You learn to follow the pain." Silas learned. He forced himself to see the world not as a blur of brown and gray, but as a map of intentions. He began to see the subtle signs, the faint whispers of passage. But every lesson was haunted by the ghost of the stable boy, a life that had been a broken thing on a floor of hay. He wasn't just learning to track outlaws. He was learning to track the echo of his own failure. The first time Elias made him practice with the Colt was a disaster. He set up a tin can on a rock 50 paces away. The gun felt monstrous in Silas's hand, a violent extension of his will that he didn't want. He raised it, his arm trembling. He saw the boy's wide, surprised eyes. He saw Ghost's head turning away for the last time. He fired. The shot was a deafening crack that sent a tremor up his arm. The bullet kicked up dust 10 feet to the left of the can. He fired again and again, emptying the cylinder in a frantic, useless barrage. The can remained untouched. "Damn it!" he roared, throwing the gun to the ground in a fit of pure, impotent rage. Elias walked over and calmly picked up the pistol. He didn't scold him. He simply began reloading it with methodical precision. "You're trying to kill a tin can," he said, his back to Silas. "There's no heart in it. No reason. You can't hit what you don't respect." "Respect?" Silas scoffed. "It's a can. Everything you aim at is a choice," Elias countered, turning to face him, his eyes holding a profound, weary gravity. "You're not aiming at the target. You're aiming at an idea. The idea of the man who left that boy to bleed out in the straw, the man who takes what he wants and burns the rest. You find that anger. You let it get cold and hard as the steel in your hand. Then you won't miss." That night, around a small smokeless fire, the silence between them stretched, filled only by the crackle of burning mesquite. "Who was she?" Silas asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. Elias looked up from cleaning the pistol, his hands never stopping their slow circular motion. "Who the one Cain? The one he took from you." Elias was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the dancing flames. When he spoke, his voice was a low, hollow thing, a sound from a deep, empty well. "Her name was Sarah, and my daughter was called Hope." He said the names as if they were fragile, sacred things. He wasn't robbing us. There was nothing to take. He was just passing through, him and his men. They wanted water and horses. I told them no. They burned my home to the ground for the satisfaction of it. It was never about the gold, Silas. Not for him. It's about the cruelty, the power in making the world uglier than he found it. The confession hung in the air, a testament to a grief so profound it had become a part of the landscape itself. The next day, Elias put the tin can back on the rock. He handed the reloaded pistol to Silas. This time Silas didn't see a can. He saw the sneering, scarred face from the stable. He saw a homestead burning against a night sky. He saw a little girl named Hope. He raised the gun. His hand was perfectly still. The world went silent. He squeezed the trigger. The can flew from the rock, a single perfect hole punched through its center. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel pride. He felt a cold, grim sense of arrival. He had learned the lesson. They found the trail 2 days later, a clear, unmistakable path leading into the treacherous maze of the Black Hills. But as Elias knelt to examine the tracks, a frown etched itself onto his face. "What is it?" Silas asked. "There's more," Elias murmured, touching the edge of a print. "Cain has 12 men. These are his tracks, all right. But there are others. 4, maybe 5 riders. Their horses are well shod, military grade, and they're not following Cain, they're riding with him." Silas felt a new chill, one that had nothing to do with the coming night. This wasn't a gang of outlaws hiding in the hills. This was something else. Something organized. Something with powerful friends. Elias stood up, his gaze fixed on the dark, brooding mountains ahead. "The rot goes deeper than I thought," he said, his voice a grim prophecy. "Cain isn't just running. He's riding to meet someone." The Black Hills rose like the jagged spine of a sleeping dragon, a place where the air grew thin and secrets lay buried deep. Following the twisted trail, Silas and Elias came to a place the maps called Whisper Creek, an abandoned mining camp slowly being reclaimed by the pines. It was a ghost town built on a fever dream of gold, its cabins collapsing under the weight of forgotten greed. It was the perfect place for a final reckoning. From a high ridge, they looked down. The camp was not abandoned. Cain's men were there, 12 rough shapes scattered around a dying fire. And with them were the 4 other riders, their horses well-groomed, their military-style dusters, a stark contrast to the outlaws' rags. Standing in their midst, his face illuminated by the fire, was a man Silas had only seen on wanted posters from the Black Creek heist. Jedediah Cain. But it was the man he was talking to that made the blood freeze in Silas's veins. Impeccably dressed, untouched by the grit and grime of the trail, stood Major Albright, the commander who had supposedly vanished in the ambush. The betrayal was absolute, a breathtaking abyss of lies. It was never a robbery. It was a conspiracy. He sold his own men. Silas breathed the words, catching in his throat. He sold everyone. Elias corrected his voice, a low, dangerous whisper. His face was a mask of stone, but Silas could see a fire banked deep in his eyes, a flame that had been burning for years, waiting for this very moment. They'll be dividing the rest of the gold. Greed makes men deaf and blind. That's our only advantage. The plan was not to charge into the valley of death. The plan was to set the wolves on each other. Elias unslung a rifle from his saddle, a long-barreled Sharps. It was a hunter's weapon meant for precision at a distance. He lay on his belly at the edge of the ridge, becoming a part of the rock. Silas watched his own heart, a slow, heavy drum. This was the culmination of everything: the horse, the Nugget, the stable boy, the long ride through hell. Below, Albright gestured to a heavy iron-strapped lockbox sitting between the 2 groups. Elias took a long, slow breath. The world seemed to hold its own. He wasn't aiming at a man. He was aiming at the greed that bound them. The Sharps rifle cracked, its single sharp report echoing through the canyon like the clap of doom. Down in the camp, the heavy padlock on the lockbox exploded in a shower of sparks. For a half-second, there was utter stunned silence. Then Cain's head whipped around, his eyes blazing with suspicion, not at the hills, but at Albright. Albright, in turn, saw the rifle shot as a betrayal from Cain's side, a move to take it all. His hand instantly went to his sidearm. That was all it took. The fragile trust between thieves shattered. "You treacherous snake!" Cain roared, leveling his own pistol. The camp erupted. It wasn't a battle. It was a maelstrom, a furious, panicked firefight of allies turning on allies of greed devouring itself. Now Elias said, rising, "We go hunt." They descended into the chaos, two avenging angels moving through a storm of their own making. They were not part of the main fight. They were the reapers on its edges. An outlaw would rise from behind a wagon to take aim, and a shot from Elias's pistol would put him down. Another would turn on Silas, and the cold, grim focus he had learned took over. He fired not with anger, but with a terrible clarity. His shots found their mark. He moved through the fight, his mind a quiet island in the storm. He saw a man with a jagged scar on his face, the man from the stable reloading by a dead horse. Their eyes met across the swirling gunsmoke. This was his ghost for the boy. Silas raised his Colt, squeezed the trigger, and shot the gun from the man's hand. The outlaw cried out, clutching his shattered fingers, his fight over. Silas didn't fire again. He had stopped the threat. That was enough. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun, leaving a field of dead and dying men. The only two left standing from the two factions were Kane and Albright, now facing each other over the open lockbox which glittered with government gold. Elias stepped out from behind a ruined cabin. "It's over, Jedediah," he said, his voice carrying across the silent camp. Kane spun around, his face a mask of fury and surprise. "Vance, you're a damn ghost." "You made me one," Elias said. He looked at Albright. "You and the good major here." Albright sneered. "The dead tell no tales, old man." He raised his pistol to fire at Elias, but he never had the chance. Kane, seeing his final betrayal, let out a final nihilistic roar and shot Albright square in the back. The major crumpled a look of shock on his face. As Kane turned his gun on Elias, Elias fired once. The shot was clean, final. Jedediah Kane fell beside the man he had just murdered, his hand landing in the pile of glittering gold. Silence. The wind whispered through the dead camp. It was over. They gathered the gold. They found their horses, and tied to Albright's own mount, looking thin and tired but blessedly unharmed, was a familiar, ghostly shape. "Ghost," Silas whispered. The horse's ears pricked. It walked toward him and nudged his shoulder just as it had done a lifetime ago. Silas buried his face in its mane, the smell of home, of honor, of a life he thought was gone forever, filling his lungs. He was whole again. They rode out of Whisper Creek as the sun began to rise, leading the pack horses laden with the heavy gold. "What now?" Silas asked, his voice rough. "Now we finish it," Elias said. "This gold goes back to Fort Laramie. There will be questions. A trial." He looked at Silas. "You're free to go, son. Your name is clear." Silas looked at the horizon, no longer a threat, but a clean, open promise. He looked at Elias, the man who had seen a flicker of a spine in a broken soul. He looked down at the leather reins in his hand, feeling their familiar solid weight. "I think," Silas said, a slow smile spreading across his face for the first time in years, "that Fort Laramie is on my way. I'll ride with you." Elias Vance nodded, a faint, weary smile touching his own lips. They spurred their horses on, two men riding into the dawn. Not a drifter and a ghost, but a man who had found his honor, and another who had finally, after a long, dark night, found his peace. The weight of the reins in Silas's hands felt more real, more valuable than all the gold in the world.